ask you to begin with to introduce yourself better than I did, and maybe to explain the link you have with digital trust. Maybe we can ask Christophe Cianci to start. Good. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Guy. So I'm going to talk about our association, Alliance pour la Confiance Numérique. It aims at representing companies in the sector of digital trust. It relates to two main elements, namely cybersecurity and trust services. So it's related to digital identity. So within this alliance, ACN, we have over 100 companies. This is representative of the sector. So we have three main working groups. One group on digital identity. I am the vice chair of this working group. Another one specifically dedicated to cybersecurity, and a third one on artificial intelligence, since this is an ever significant topic, and this is why we decided to create a working group in this field. Later on, I will delve more into details to talk to you about our activities, but I think that I can give the floor now. Thank you. So, could you please tell us about the company Chambersign and its relationship with trust? Thank you, Guy. Thank you for your introduction on the. So what I can say is that it's been 20 years that the association Chambersign was created, and at the time we talked about PRIS. So it is prehistoric, and Chambersign, our association, was created because the state needed to identify savers. We needed to identify the identity of companies and of stakeholders. So 20 years ago, we framed digital identity, and now Chambersign represents 25 collaborators. We are located in Lyon, and we are the very last pure player in digital identity, in the form of certificate, because it's the historic form of digital identity. But there are other forms of digital identities, as we've seen in the past few days. Thank you, Stephen Gash. Frederick Gavin now. Please, over to you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Guy. So now I'd like to focus on administration, because I created a company, Nosfi Conseil, which relates administrations, makes a link between administration and the tech sector, because now we see that all issues pertaining to AI, identity, digital transformation were generated by an entire ecosystem, and on the side, the state, local authorities, and the public sector needs to transform. However, the way in which they exchange vary a lot. I've worked for 20 years in this public sector, and I created my company realizing that we needed to make a link these two sectors. So now I'm going to talk about administrations and digital identity. So thank you. Now I'd like to ask Stefan Gash whether you could talk about the concept of professional digital identity and why it's important to create trust within companies. Well, professional digital identity is made up of an identity and a profession. It's about the link there is between an individual who works in the public or private sector and the other agents, employees, partners who act for an organization. So on the one hand, we have an individual, and on the other, we have all the other partnerships which allow us to take due account of the individual's need. I'm going to give you a banal example, but if you want to register to the FIC, F-I-C, to the forum using a Wanadu, it will be refused. Why? Because you need a professional address to do it. And these examples are numerous on a daily basis. In the digital era, we need to replicate this mechanism, and up until now, the digital certificate allowed us to do it. This brings trust, a first level of trust. It shows that there is a relationship, and it allows us to create a remote relationship. Secondly, and it's related to something that existed for quite a long time, is that if we mainstream digital identities, we can use them internally, and we can foster traceability. So it becomes a structuring element and not a mandatory element. It becomes a tool on a daily basis in order to promote trust and to realize that there is a breach because a mail wasn't signed or that a document hasn't been certified, or to prevent attacks. When a company has a strong authentication system, we can prevent fraud. Thank you, Stéphane Gache. So, other question. We talked quite a lot about electronic invoices, about quotes, POs, and other corporate documents, such as general conditions. So, has it become a new normal now for companies in France? And second question, why is it a necessity? Well, I wouldn't go so far to say that this has become a reality, but an increasing number of companies realize that once a document leaves a company, we don't know what happens. And it is clear that there is a risk of fraud. However, all documents that leave companies can be modified, altered, and it's very complicated to prevent fraud. So this is why general conditions can improve corporate image. So we need terms and conditions in order to have tangible elements and to reassure the audience. Second point, in an organization, when we have documents in circulation, sometimes we don't know what is the right version because there is a lack of organization. And there are mechanisms which are easy to use for any SME. Finally, to talk about electronic signature, thanks to electronic signatures, SMEs do not have to ask themselves too many questions. So this is a very easy to use and cost-effective tool when it is systematically implemented and when it's not a constraint. Well, what I remember from what you said is that documents are essential to promote corporate trust. And now, Gavin, I'd like to ask you whether in administrations, especially the administrations you work with, is the same as in the private sector. Well, to begin with, we need to say that this relates to the public sector partners and not the public sector users, because this is another topic. So within administrations, trusts manifest itself at three levels. First, simplicity. Second, efficiency. Simplicity first, because if you have a complicated application, it's very important within the administration to have easy to use apps, particularly in the public sector, due to the universal challenges, as we are not only targeting one target audience. Simplicity, because if you have an app or a software which is used differently to its original aim, this will have a negative impact on trust and it will be inefficient. And this will have huge ramifications, since all users in the public sector might be impacted. And then security, because public agents, of course, want to have secured apps. They don't want to have issues with regard to access and security. So, to give you an example, for example, of one tool which was a success and which relates to identity, we can talk about Comedec. It is a platform of the Ministry of the Interior, and it allowed to dematerialize acts while issuing ID cards and passports. And this is quite interesting because in the past we used to have a paper document. Users needed to go to the city council, but now everything is dematerialized. It happens with the city council. It allows us to have something safe, efficient, and secure. Plus, it reduces the risks for fraud, because when we have paper document, we can have false paper document as well. So this tool fostered trust for agents in the public sector, and it had positive impacts on users. It allowed us to cut red tape and to gain time. Especially that for these documents we need efficiency, we need to have them as soon as possible. One other question I'd like to ask, when it comes to identities and access, what are the current practices right now in administration when it comes to authentication? Well, we have a twofold authentication with an access code and a token, and this allows us to directly enter information. We also use a technology which allows the person behind his or her screen to not have to log in again and again. So this is very convenient, and it also guarantees security. But what I would like to add, And what I found rather more interesting is to really understand authentication as a process to manage access. And this brings me to another important point. We need to align the position of the person using credentials to the situation. Here we need to think about the volume, because there is a bigger situation in terms of HR and we need to make sure that the positions match. So it's related to many changes, and it allows us to align everything to make sure that the perimeter is secure. So if I understand you well, you focus on managing authorizations to make sure that it's related to everything. Yes, and we need to have a follow-up, a timely follow-up. So this trust was also greatly important, very important. We had a health crisis, which also created new habits for companies, since they had to change their trust mechanisms. So how did you do, Christophe Sionchi, with all the companies you help, when you had to deal with all employees working remotely? How did you do? Did you think about new ways in order to establish trust?
We all remember the work at the time. Some organized themselves, and others without any organization. And the companies told me that they wanted to focalize particularly on the subject and bring in solutions for our customers. We published a set of books. You can see them on my internet. You see our logo, because we work with a lot of companies. A lot of our members are here today, present. We provide different tools, and one of the tools is the brochure on capacity. This capacity brochure is a method to make the analysis. We speak about EM, SSO, and so on. And our customers, the decision makers who decide on the budget, have a good visibility over their profession, not our tools. And these customers of ours know the offers existing on the market. The brochure is not only a compilation of solutions within our members. It can be outside our members, not members of our association. So we began to do some segmentation and to explain what are the different components of a profession. So we have like a matrix. On this type of problems, we have this type of solution, and there is a very summary-wise explanation. This helps the customers and decision makers the basic concept to identify interesting counterparts. Everything is rather simple. We were all taken aback, and it was rather sudden, the pandemic. We had a group of members who took the initiative and contributed a lot especially Consorci, who was a leader on this project. And in a very short period of time, in 2-3 months, we produced documents, which is on our internet set, that helps to, it's like a list of solutions, depending on population that are more home office-wise or crypting issues, safeguarding transactions, and so on, which helps you to select and choose the right methods. Companies very often say, yes, we have an authentication. Yes, this is simple. It's not a crypting issue when you converse outside. But how are you going to integrate it within this system, which is a closed system? The partners, it's great to have a list of members. I have my employees, but I work also with the outside world. How do I integrate them into my system? This is a set of questions, like, for instance, the assistance to implementation. You would have expertise, consulting groups, agencies, and so on. So this tool is an answer. We don't have a specific working group on home office, but there is a high demand on the market that we have tools. We specified a document in order to accompany companies to protect themselves. Could be companies, it can be public services, obviously. It is open to different industries, and it helps to bring in our French expertise and to show what we are capable to do within France without having to go outside specifically. Thank you very much. This is an organization of the industry to help getting up to grips with the circumstances. Frédéric Aven. For public services, I think there were two big shocks. There was the corona shock, but before that, public services didn't know their users. They were pretty anonymous. How is it? How do public services kind of gain the trust of their users? New users or taxpayers or whatever you call them. How does this new trust zone deploy? Yeah, we're talking more about users. There are several challenges. One is the personalization of the tools. We can talk about the tax payment. There are data that are pre-filled in the form. There is a personalization of the data on your form, and here you see how the data is being used at public service level as it could happen in a company. This is very interesting because it shows new ways of simplifying the usage. Because as soon as you have a pre-filled form, before you would spend an hour or so, and if you don't have any exception in your case, you'll be done in 5 minutes or so, and you'll be happy because public services can simplify your life. This is the first thing. Second, it is more linked to the federation of services. The idea is to, instead of having different types of public services, to have one entry point. Like, for instance, France Connect, since a couple of years, enables you to have one single entry point in terms of identification of the user. Via La Poste, via the social security systems, you are being certified. If you go on to other public services internet, you don't have to create an account and fill in all your identity. So it is personalized. It is much simpler and easygoing to declare a birth of a child, or pay whatever a tax or whatever. It's getting simpler. This is what we could call the mutualization, federation of all data on one single entry point. Third, the APIization. This is what I mean is to generate an ecosystem, stakeholders around the public sectors who are helping to facilitate. Therefore, different entry points are being created right from the beginning. From the platform, we try to anticipate the future needs, usages in future, and generate an ecosystem that is not limited to public services only. This creates usages that were not known beforehand. And this is interesting then to develop. For as an example, if we look at identity, NC developed a certification of service providers for remote identification. So if we want to associate private and personal life and work life, this is one example where both sides, private and professional, is being linked together. Thank you very much. It's interesting. You described the situation. Private sector is moving forward too, and the needs are moving. Stefan Gasch. In this post-COVID era, how do you see the identity, digital identity? What are the new needs? Are we going towards infrastructures, digital infrastructures of trust? How do you think the reorganization or the development of this landscape is going to evolve in future? Let me first answer on one issue. We are working on it. This roundtable is an example. And as Frédéric said, when it comes to tax payment, we had yesterday an opening roundtable with Jean Safford, the president of the INCYBER and vice president of the National Council of Accountants, Chartered Accountants. They have access to the accounts of the customers by using a third codes. And this is an example. If you do not foresee, if there is no anticipation of third usage, this is what happens. This is the first thing we can see. Is the professional identity is being taken into account as such. This is important. This is good. And there are initiatives since 18 months or so in different parts of France leading to building up professional referentials. Some are open as open data, some software, but the site is we have private initiatives. We will not have only one provider. As identity speaker said yesterday, this is important. We will see that there will be a set of range of operators by community, by type of activities, by industry, or for historic reasons, because we are, like me, in the personal identity business anyhow. In the civil sector, we reassociate, because of the EDAS regulation number 34, we need to bring in signature and authentication. Certification is the alpha and omega up to now, and everybody will have to have his own rights, low or high, and then the use of this identity via trusted services. In the middle, so to speak, there is the moral entity and the providers. Therefore, we will need professional identification to make sure these relations can take place. And this morning, again, we said it is important to have the professional attributes. And the e-wallet is part of it, and it could be used for the design of such specification. And in 4 or 5 years, we will be probably still speaking about it anyhow. Right, the answer to the question is yes, I'm convinced, but I am not going to tell you what is going to happen in the future. Right, let me tell you another question. You said, Jean Serfort, in the opening session, he said there's still a lot of improvement, margin for improvement. The identity, there is a difference between the identity of person and of moral entities. Do you think, what do you think? Improvement, it is just beginning. It is just the beginning. It is easy to define what is a legal representative. I'm sure here some specialists in the room might be laughing, but when you go into mandates, into the powers, delegation powers, it's tricky. When you answer a public tender nowadays, you don't only need a new digital certificate. The person signing needs to have the legal right to engage the company. And when it comes to bigger companies, it's probably not going to be the CEO signing. We need a delegation that needs to be structured. If it needs to be structured automatically, it needs to be specified. And all these type of questions needs to be handled by interoperability of suppliers, because as soon as you provide a power delegation, internally it's logical, but if it is externally, it's difficult. And there we can come very near to the normalization of attributes. The scale is more a legal one. And if we have people from the banking sector here, they will know what I'm talking about, insurance companies and so on. This is typically a work we will have to do within identifiers and with the consumers. What are we talking about? And last point to answer your question, we will need stakeholders to certify these certificates. We need to structure, we need to make sure that both sides respect their legal requirements. And here there is a whole range of questions that need to be dealt with. It is feasible, but it's tricky. Thank you very much for this very complex and complete answer. Christophe Chancy, the Alliance for Trust, Digital Trust, publishes every year a paper on digital trust. We're talking about the new spheres of confidence, of trust. What is your analysis? What do you observe? What do you wish? In which direction are you going? I was talking about the tools. We have a whole range of tools. The observatory is an initiative that is already quite a lot of years back. The subject was not on the radars before, so we had to be more precise. We are collecting information, and it is very interesting, I think, for people who want to work on market analysis or structure strategy. It gives a very good visibility of the industry sector. After the pandemic, 2021, the growth came kind of back of a higher level. We were happy to have a high growth level of 7% in last year, which is pretty good. Last year, the internal, we were at 4%, so it's a heavy trend in terms of capacity. The digital sector and trust in terms of values lies at 2/3 around cyber security and 1/3 on identity services in the widest sense of the word. It is 70,000 employees and several millions euros. Within the association, we have different type of members, and we have a lot of startup, small and smallest companies. It's very dynamic startup, and we have therefore a very wide view. The trends, it brings in a lot of added value, 50% of added value, which is great, which is very high. Usually the added value is around 20-25% of added value, but it's an emerging sector, or more traditional sectors. But the potential and the dynamic shows a high potential for the future. So you need to join us, you need to invest in our sector. We need to train young people. We lack skills. And since a couple of years, we see that schools are building up and are building young people, like the university initiatives at university level, together with NSSE, that brings in its own skills. It is a moving sector, it is stable over time, and it shows new parameters in the way it works. We'll certainly discuss about it later. All the figures show macro figures, but it shows strengths, developments, and it guarantees what public services and the users wish is the autonomy, the digital autonomy in France, in Europe, in a world where people are not reassuring because of the capacity of the countries to keep their own autonomy.
Thank you very much. I remember what you said about trust and sovereignty. This is important for French companies. So, Frédéric Gavenge, there is an important point when it comes to trust, both for administration and companies. And sometimes this is striking. Here we are talking about privileged accounts. So what is it? These are the accounts of the main managers in a company, and these accounts, very often, they need they need a lot of attention, because these accounts are more vulnerable to fraud, and in the event of fraud, this can have many ramifications for the company's activities. So now I'd like to turn to you, Frédéric. What can you say about it? Because you work in companies auditing, and how do you work on these type of account? Well, indeed, for administration, this is a focus, not only for administration leaders, but also on the usual use on a daily basis, because these accounts are related to positions, to jobs, and to IT, because it allows to have a greater access to write files. So in daily operations for a company, these accounts are essential in order to modify and write data differently. So indeed, it creates a specific risk because it leads to unauthorized access, fraud, malevolent acts. So it brings many negative impacts. And this is why administration needs to focus and tries to focus on these accounts. So how, well, here we need formal, official processes. We need to really look into authorizations to open such accounts. We talked about delegating signatures. Well, here we also need a delegation which is compliant, and this is not always simple. This is why earlier on I said that IT habilitations need to match with positions, but also with signature delegations. So there is the legal aspect, but also the aspect of IT system security. And this relates to creating and using these accounts. So beyond authorizations, we need follow-up. We need to know what are the users, how many they are, and also beyond that, there is another issue, namely auditability, systems auditability. In other words, we need to know who does what, at what time. For example, if we want to know what agent did such and such action. We can also talk about generic accounts. They are related but different in the way that these are broader accounts. More users can open them without knowing how to use these accounts, and this is why it creates more flexibility compared with accounts which are dedicated to only one person. So here again we need to define the authentication processes, looking into digital identity. And this might seem counterintuitive, but this is reality. In audit, we need to know that a generic account was assigned to such and such person in order to have traceability and to be able to master this use. Thank you very much for this very interesting explanation. I have another question. This is another topic, but when we look at corporate digital identity at the global level, we see that there are some guidelines. The G20 asked to strengthen the identity of individuals who are carrying out international transactions, and it led to a new corporate identity. It does not involve all companies, but some markets. And we also see that there are new regulations against money laundering, against fraud. So all stakeholders are talking about individuals, about digital identity. All this against the backdrop of sanctions and embargoes. This involves suppliers, large corporations. So this topic of company identity becomes increasingly important. And this is why this brings me to my question to you, Stéphane Gache, what mechanisms there is at the national level, and are you calling for the creation of an ecosystem on this topic, on the topic of digital corporate identity, to replicate what happened at the global level? Well, for a very long time, I called for this, and IDAS V1 replicated some of these ideas. In IDAS, we have two technologies to identify companies, and more recently, April. So indeed, companies are faced with a new reality. They start to have a digital identity. In France, however, I think that, like always, it will be tax that will bring us to create an interoperable ecosystem, because of the B2B invoice project, which will be rolled out in 2024. And there is one mechanism which will force companies to provide information with regard to invoice. So companies, in other words, have less than 24 months to create an interoperable ecosystem, and they will have to look at all the issues we mentioned on delegating powers. And I think that we need to start working from now on. So yes, I have been calling for the creation of an ecosystem, and this is all the more true now because we really have an issue with interoperability. Thank you, Stéphane Gache. Do we have questions for our speakers? If you have a question, please raise your hand. Please, sir. I'd like to go back to the topic of generic identities or privileged identities. In the world of companies, sometimes I hear about 4 eyes principles. Someone who wants to change something in the system but cannot do it on his own, where we need 2 or 3 people. So what do you think about it, and is there a way to standardize this? So the question is about task distribution, because some decisions can be made only by a group. Well, this is exactly what I wanted to say earlier, because the use of generic accounts, which can be created by several people, is for this, and indeed there is a potential danger. How can we know for sure who is behind the screen? So the idea here is to really identify people, to have follow-up, and to have traceability. This is essential for security. And this is quite complex and difficult because we know that both for the corporate world and for administrations, when we want to change services, to reshuffle things, very often this is an emergency, and security and internal audits are not necessarily priority. So very often we have to create a generic account as an emergency, and we don't really know who is behind the screen. This raises the question of security, since this is very, very significant. But we shouldn't lose sight of the security which is required here, because when, for example, there is a data breach or data theft, if you have a very efficient system, a data theft will still have a lot of ramifications. So you shouldn't lose sight of this. You should bear in mind the incurred risk, which can be very wide-ranging in this field. Thank you very much. Do we have any other question? Well, I have a question. Earlier on, we talked about the prospect of the e-wallet for professional use. So, Christophe, maybe do you have something to say about it, because you work on this at the ACN, so what is your vision? It is true that we had a lot of work this year, and the working group on digital identity had to work a lot. We have SMEs, we have large corporations, and we all work together. The purpose being to strengthen, to contribute to the European process. You all know about the Toolbox initiative. It will rather involve citizens, but it will also have ramifications for companies, because EDAS V2 also includes companies. So we had to work with the state as well, because you should remember that at the European levels, everything takes place between member states. We work with companies, with institutions. For example, France Identité Numérique, which was at the origin of creating ID cards. We also worked on the verification of remote providers for identification processes. And this was important in the last 2 years, because due to COVID, we had to work remotely and we couldn't stop the economy. So all this phenomenon was a real boost. And the public, the state agreed with us. So there were a lot of exchanges. And you also know that in France we are quite conservative when it comes to security. We are not the only ones. So things are moving forward little by little. We need to look into economic trends, and this brings with it a lot of work. So we will see the result. We will see the result of EDAS 2 second. But if you're interested in this topic, I highly encourage you to join our working groups, because it is very, very positive for SMEs. I myself represent SMEs, and this is all very important for our ecosystem. To develop the ecosystem, we need all types of actors, small, big. Did you want to add something on the e-wallet and the need for companies and individuals? Well, when it comes to the e-wallet, I would like to say that this is a structuring element. This is something very important. It's not something we use once or sometimes. This is something that will have an impact on all professionals. And to give you an example, I came with my badge, my partner badge, and this morning I took a speaker badge. So this is a personal identity attribute, and I think that this is a future. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the three of you. And to conclude, could you just give us a few words or phrase to sum up this roundtable on digital trust and corporate trust? Please, Christophe. Well, I think that we need to learn to work differently. The digital world is different from the physical world. So we need flexibility and we need nuance. This is why we need to call into question our position, our jobs, and this will be a challenge for the upcoming years. Frederick, do you want to say something? Well, briefly, what I can say is that identity is an essential factor for companies and their development, but as well also for the public sector. And when we use identity authentication, we allow authorities and administrations to facilitate access to services. I think that this will be essential in the future. Thank you, Frederick. Stéphane Gache, do you have a conclusion for this roundtable? Well, the only one I think of is that this should become second nature in the end. So, thank you. A round of applause for our speakers. Thank you for your contribution on corporate trust. So now we are going to have a small break. You have some time for a coffee, and we will meet again in 15 minutes for an interview with the Vice President of Security Alliance. Right after, at 3:30, we will have a plenary on the new digital identity in Europe, the new framework on European digital identity. Thank you.